just you get to choose. Right? Like here's the scenario. The environment gives us something which can be perceived as negative, can be perceived as not working, can be perceived as problematic. The world's ending. But we get to choose to see it like that, or we get to choose to see it as an opportunity.
So clearly that it's my responsibility now to do that for other people. If I have information and, other people's success is my success and vice versa.
Because you know what? Like, the challenges or the roadblocks are the journey themselves.
There's no big things. It's all little things compounding on top of each other. All right, welcome to another episode of Truth Seekers. We have Coach John Zeev guest hosting today, and along with myself, Coach Josh Greco. We have Will Sparks joining us today. I'm very excited to have Will join us. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you. I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you and look forward to our conversation. You had asked a little bit about my background. I am a professor and chair of leadership in the McCall School of Business at Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've taught here for 22 years, and my background and my degrees are in organizational psychology. And I have been involved extensively in sort of shadow work. I'm heavily influenced by the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, and do a lot of my approach in leader development, team development, organization development, and executive coaching by accounting for and appreciating the power of the shadow, whether it's at the individual, team, or organizational level, and helping individuals and teams sort of confront that, accept it, acknowledge it, and then integrate it so that they're able to perform at their optimal level.
I hit a few key buzzwords already. Integrate is a good one for us as well. I would love to maybe just level set for people who might be watching this, Will, who don't know some of those buzzwords. What even is the shadow? How did you come across that? How would you define the shadow? Like, what is the shadow?
Yeah. Well, I came across it. I've got a TED Talk entitled The Power of Self-Awareness. That's sort of my story. And so I came across my shadow at the very able hands of my now late professor, Dr. Jerry Harvey. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the Abilene Paradox, which is the famous story of sort of a groupthink that occurs when groups cannot manage their agreement. And that's Dr. Jerry Harvey. And I was his doctoral student at George Washington University. Long story short, he gave me an A on a project, but he gave me an F in life because of how my shadow was showing up and the cost the sort of the damage that it was creating. And if anyone's interested, they could watch the TED Talk to get that sort of story. That's how I was introduced to it. And I just very distinctly remember that whatever framework Dr. Harvey has, whatever insight about human behavior he has, the fact that I was 27 years old when I started the PhD program, and the fact that he knew me better in 3.5 months than I knew myself in 27 years, I thought, I want that. That's what I want. That's what I want to spend my life doing. And so that was my introduction. And from that, I've developed a number of assessments that allow individuals and teams to assess their shadow. With individuals, I've identified 3 shadows in applied professional settings: the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, and the fear of betrayal. And those are grounded in sort of this unconscious fear. So you ask about, well, what is the shadow? I think the most useful analogy or metaphor is to think of the Mr. or Mrs. Hyde side to our Dr. Jekyll persona. So Dr. Jekyll is what we want people to see and experience, but we all have, as Carl Jung called it, the other that is there lying within sort of. And so that shadow is sort of this side that gets activated under stress. It's an unconscious reaction, and it's grounded in these sort of iceberg beliefs or fears that we carry. And if we don't recognize it and we don't acknowledge it and accept it, if we deny it or project it, then we actually give it even greater power over us. And so my work has really been focused on helping people identify what I call their leadership shadow, and then take very definitive steps toward integrating it. Now, here's the challenge in an organizational setting. So I've identified 3 shadows, and there are 3 styles that correspond with those. Let's just take the first one, for example. An achiever has a fear of failure shadow. Achievers are detailed-oriented, uber-organized, very efficient, well-disciplined, very, success-driven, recognition-driven, sort of they're the performance engine in organizations. And so the irony of an achiever is that under stress, they become rigid. Those light qualities go dark. So narrow-minded, rigid, critical. And the Achilles heel from a management and leadership perspective is that they become micromanaging. And when they do that, they almost guarantee that they're either going to experience an outright failure, i.e., their star performers are going to tap out of their team, or they limit the trajectory of their success in their career because the CEO or the CHRO sees them as a strong contributor, but really not a leader. And so they often sort of, again, they artificially limit what could have been the trajectory of their career by staying in that contributor category because they just can't let anything go. They want it to be their way. They want it to be perfect. They're willing to work all hours of the night. And, organizations will take advantage of that sort of mindset. And so that, and all 3 of the styles have this sort of paradoxical irony that they bring about the very thing they're trying to avoid if you don't integrate that shadow component.
I see a lot of nodding from Coach Z, so I think you're on the same page with him with a lot of what you're saying. And Z, I'm wondering if you have questions or comments about, like, we could take this conversation so many different directions, and I have tons of questions, but go ahead with whatever is coming to mind for you.
Yeah, I will. I have been working with the shadow. I guess I wrote an article about the shadow about 7-8 years ago, but it wasn't until I came across the work of Phil Stutz. Are you familiar with Phil Stutz?
I know the name, yes.
There's a documentary on Netflix with Jonah Hill, and he's Jonah Hill's therapist, and he talks about tools. It's called the Tools Book. Anyhow, I started experimenting with these tools, and it's like, oh my God, the shadow is real. It's alive, and so I started to. In fact, Coach Josh can attest. We had fun with our shadows at our most recent retreat. We all got to meet our shadows, and we all shared our shadows with each other. And they weren't necessarily a failure, rejection, or betrayal shadow, but they were getting in our way.
Yeah.
And once we got to embrace them and truly love them, then they kind of took on a whole different, like they were our best friends, like they are our power.
Yeah.
Right. They can be they are our creativity. So it became very empowering to experience that energy, that knowledge, that wisdom that the shadow has. And I've just become a student of it and been sharing this with my clients ever since.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that there's a little bit of a misconception with some folks that are in this sort of in this lane or doing this sort of work, where they think that we want to sort of shine a light on the shadow and sort of wrestle it down to the ground and clear the decks and get it out of the way so that we can just operate, consciously. And of course, not only can we not do that, we don't want to do that. As you say, it's a source of tremendous creativity. Persistence comes from the shadow, that those flashes of brilliance or insight, tenacity. There are just so many positive things that come with it. But the trick is that we have to be vulnerable and let our guard down in order to sort of allow it to come out. Now, Jung famously said, it's better to be whole than perfect. And so if we think of perfect as, well, my shadow is way over here in the corner and I've got a bright light on it and it's not going to bother me or anyone else, it's not attainable. And so I loved Jung's sort of comment around being whole and embracing all of that aspect of ourselves. The trick really, and this is just my opinion, having done this work for a number of years, and this is where Jung sort of left us hanging a little bit. The trick is, how do you embrace it and not indulge it? And he sort of said, well, you got to figure that out, yourself. That's a little bit different from everyone. And I suppose that's a fair answer, but that therein lies the sort of the art versus a science. How do we acknowledge it, embrace it, and integrate it without, indulging it to a certain degree? And so I think that's a personal journey for each of us.
Well, part of this, when I first started working with Coach Z on this, I wanted to understand it more. I knew it felt right to me, which is why I wanted to go more deeply into it, and I started getting results from it. Could you speak more to, like, where does our shadow come from? Is that from a place of trauma, something that we experienced in the past, or like how does it know us so well?
That's a great question. So I think, first of all, just to back up for a moment, you think about the Freudian sort of view that started so psychodynamic is the broad category that considers the role of the unconscious or the shadow in driving human behavior. So that's psychodynamic. Within that is the psychoanalytic tradition that's Freudian, and you've got the id sort of there, that's the devil, and you've got the superego, that's the angel, and they're sort of fighting it out internally. And from Freud's perspective, the shadow was in us, inside of us. Jung, and this is a sort of a subtle, it takes a bit of reflection. Jung's view was that we're in it. It's not in us. We're in it. And by that, he meant that there's a collective shadow that we both inherit and participate in. And so part of it is, what we sort of our various family or culture or region of the country or wherever we may live. I mean, there's some elements there that Jung would say help define us. But then that personal shadow piece that you're really getting at, that's often developed at a very early age, and it can be trauma, or it can be relatively minor things that a parent may say, well, don't be greedy, or don't be lazy, or why did you make a B instead of an A? So things like that can begin to create those shadow behaviors. And so along with the three shadows that I mentioned, there are what I call in my work 3 eternal questions. And those are the things that really are at the heart of the matter. And for the achiever in the fear of failure, the eternal question is, am I worthy? And so those individuals are constantly trying to prove to themselves and the world that they're worthy. Another accomplishment, another win, another degree, another certification, another 7 Series Beamer, another country club membership. I mean, they're just always trying to fill that sort of that eternal question or that void around worthiness. For the affirmer and the fear of rejection, it's more relationship driven, and their eternal question is, am I wanted? So at a very early age, they were taught and reinforced to, be seen and not heard, be the peacemaker. Other people's needs are more important than yours. Don't be selfish, always serve others. And to a degree, that's helpful. And then when the shadow kicks in, it's often those kind of managers become conflict avoidant. They're overly accommodating. They're indecisive. When decisive action's taken, they're needed. They often are quite indecisive. So that eternal question is, am I wanted? And the third style, which is mine, an asserter, ours is a fear of betrayal. And so these are independence, control, power-driven individuals that are decisive and are results-oriented. But our eternal question is, am I safe? And so for many asserters, they felt unsafe, either physically or psychologically, or perhaps out of control at an early age. And we've decided we don't like that. We're not going to feel that way again. So we're going to be in control. We're going to land the first shot. We're going to get in the first punch. We're going to win the argument. We're going to be right. We're going to make the other person wrong. And then our Achilles heel is that we create dependency at home and at work. And that was my conversation with Dr. Harvey, and really the subject of my TED Talk. And so yes, so the shadow is created at an early age. It's sort of grounded in these 3 themes around worthiness, being wanted, or safety. And here's the so what of all of this. If individuals don't do this deep, reflective self-awareness work, that can be hard work. If you don't do it, though, the other option is that you live out the rest of your life believing that these tacit assumptions that you made when you were 5 years old are in fact true when you're 55 or 85. You know, we just live our entire lives with those driving our behaviors. So the work can be challenging, it can be emotional, but the other alternative is just sort of a miss with that and carrying that around and not even knowing it sometimes, not even consciously being aware of how those questions and those fears are driving us. Now, those around us, they understand it, they see it in our behavior, but very often we're blind to it ourselves.
Awesome. I love what you're talking about. I'm curious. I would like to see the assessments that you have. We have a proprietary assessment tool we use, and I've said to myself recently, the past month or so, I'd like to write an article about how the mind scan, what we call the mind scan, in the shadow, how you can tell someone's shadow from the way they think about themselves and others. So I'm curious to learn about the role of assessments with identifying the shadow, maybe even comparing the Hartman value profile with you. It sounds like you've built a nice career around this topic.
Yeah, well, thank you. I've developed and validated 5 different assessments. There is the actualized leader profile. There's a full version of that, but there's a free version that anyone can take. It's online. They choose 10 word pairs, and you get your results immediately. And that's ALPfree.com, and that stands for Actualized Leader Profile. ALPfree.com. And that is really that's provided in my book, Actualized Leadership, Meeting Your Shadow and Maximizing Your Potential. And so that free assessment's a part of that. Then there's a free team assessment that's ATP free, which is Actualized Team Profile. And then there's a 360 and a full team assessment as well. And to your point, I think more than anything, what the free assessment provides is a starting place for a person. So otherwise you're thinking about, gosh, I have no idea. What is my shadow? Very often what people think and what's really underneath is very, very different. So when I ask people to self-declare what they think they are, most people will raise their hand and say they're an achiever. Harvard Business School has profiled these famous individuals by these 3 styles. And so Michael Jordan and Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates and Lady Gaga, they're all achievers. And people see those names and faces and they're like, yeah, I work hard and all of that. But very often they find out that they're an affirmer, that they're actually relationship driven. So they may be very successful, but what's core for them is the relationship that allows them to either maintain or perhaps create or provide for or care for. It's not about the personal recognition. So I think maybe more than anything, my model allows a person to identify, is it a fear of failure? Is it a fear of rejection? Or is it a fear of betrayal? And that gives them a solid starting point to go, okay, and so what are the implications for me and for my team or family, whatever it may be, if I don't, sort of get around this and begin to integrate this aspect?
Will, I want to go back to something that you said, just to share a personal experience with working with the shadow. You said that it's hard, and I thought about that. Like I reflected on some of my work. It's very difficult, and I want to kind of shine a light on that, because that, like, somebody watching this might be like, well, why would I do something hard? Why would I want to do that? I think you nailed it with how you ended that that paragraph, talking about, like, once you become conscious of it, then it's almost like you can't go back. Like, now that I know this about myself, it's like, what do I do? And just from my experience, it's like admitting something that I've been unconsciously denying for my life that has taken control. It's like how I operate. And it's a pretty wild moment to come to that realization that it almost feels like it's been not fake, but like there's been more to the story that I haven't known, and I've only been operating with like half a book. And so
that's a great metaphor.
Yeah, and the only solution is to do the hard thing then. Like I can't see not doing it. And then, like, I want to share this too, like, because it's hard, there are some incredible insights and I guess it comes through for, by way of emotions for me. Like I feel relieved sometimes. I feel enlightened. I feel
Yep.
it just provides this I don't know if satisfaction is the word, because it also never ends, right? And that's where I'm going with this, with my next question. Like you've been doing this for so long, I'm curious. Like, are you good? You figured out your shadow? Like, what's next for you? How do you keep going with this work?
Well, so let me first of all, you're spot on with the point about it can be hard work because we've spent our entire life unconsciously denying, in my case as an asserter, that I'm controlling, that I'm autocratic, that I'm arrogant, that I manipulate others, that I think I'm the smartest person in the room. I interrupt, I finish sentences. I mean, and I create dependency. Those are all terrible things. I want to lead with, well, I'm confident, I'm decisive. At my best, I'm charismatic. I will take a risk. I think I care for other people. That's all true, but so's the other piece. It's both and. It's not either or. So it is. There is that sort of moment of it's an existential crisis. So you have to be vulnerable, and then I think a person has to take responsibility, and that's what happened with me. Like I'd gone, my experience with Dr. Harvey taught me that as much as I wanted the world to feel sorry for me in my failed marriage, it was my fault. It was not my ex's fault. It was my fault. And so for me to be motivated to do this shadow work was the realization that if I don't, I'm going to create dysfunctional dependency in other relationships, professionally and personally, and then it'll play itself out and I'll be sitting right where I am again. So that's the option. And so we have to admit things about ourselves that we would rather not. But the last thing I want to comment on is you hit the nail on the head. The emotion, the integration, the wholeness that a person experiences when they bring these two together, when they have this awareness. I remember very vividly living in Northern Virginia and having a sort of this corresponding, simultaneously, I felt incredible sadness and guilt and grief. But I also felt an incredible sense of liberation and insight because I realized I understand this now and I can choose to do this differently. I can show up in a different way. So I want to underscore that. And then finally, to your last question, Carl Jung was asked by the BBC, I think it was the last interview he ever gave in 1959, essentially like, well, so now that you've mastered your shadow, what have you, what's next kind of thing? And how did you do that? And he sort of puffed on his pipe and smiled and said, my dear fellow, the best that any of us can hope for is a lifelong negotiation with the other. And so it's not a one and done. And the more you do this work, the more sort of things I'll notice like, hey, I got really triggered right there or that, and so he talked about it's present and real in all of us. And so I think trying to have a beginner's mind, trying to have a marked humility, being open to feedback, and all of that is critical for just continual growth. Certainly have a very long way, I think, to go on my journey. I have a heightened awareness, I think, but with that comes a realization that, gosh, I've got a long way to go. And so, but with that, though, I do think we also have to give ourselves permission, though, to get out of our head, too, and go and have a beer or watch a game and have some fun. And you can take it, you can go too far. I know some people that have sort of gotten addicted to the navel gazing, and there's another assessment, there's another weekend retreat, and there's something else and something. And this is the world I live in, and sometimes I'm facilitating those retreats, so I don't want to be hypocritical. But I also try to end the day with a happy hour or some kind of social where we can, we got to have a sense of humor about all of this as well, or I think we can, you can sort of go and stay in a dark place if you're not careful.
Love it. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask a question, Coach?
Yeah.
So I'm curious I love stories, so I'm curious if you have any really successful stories about a leader in a corporate environment who was not exposed, was not aware of his shadow. He became aware of his shadow, and consequently, he changed really the trajectory of that company because he became more whole and he allowed others around him to contribute from their shadows. I wonder if you have a story that comes to mind.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And there are actually several folks that are running through my mind right now over the last, 20 years of doing this sort of work. Maybe not as intentionally as calling it the shadow until maybe the last 10 years or so, maybe 15 years. But there's one person that the first person I thought of was an individual who is a C-suite executive right now, probably on the short list to be the successor to the CEO of a company. It recently went public, very, very successful organization. And this individual had a sort of a moment of crisis and existential angst where some 360-degree feedback and some direct feedback he had gotten from his CEO really sort of aligned with some feedback that he had gotten on the home front around the same time. And that has a way of getting our attention when those line up. And I just happened to be standing in the right place at the right time. And we share the asserter style, we share the tendencies. And so we really spoke the same language. And I think because of that, he was able to let his guard down a little bit more quickly. And that through that vulnerability really began to integrate the different shadow traits and different components. And I've heard second and third hand, not asking the question, because a lot of folks, actually some of the folks, I won't say a lot, some of the folks that have told me this don't even realize that we had a professional executive coaching relationship, have commented on, he's a different person, and he's showing up in a completely different way. Used to sit at the head of the table, used to be very formal, never laughed at himself, told you what he thought first, asked if anyone saw it a different way, quickly called the question, and it was out and on, and you saluted and said, yes, sir, and you were off and running. And now, much less formal, sits off to the side of the table, listens first, asks questions before stating an opinion. I mean, I could just go on. And some of the, really just a much better sense of humor, lighter. And here's the crazy thing. His results are better than they've ever been. He's now in the C-suite. He may likely be running this company in a few years, and he's just having so much more fun doing it because he's being just more authentic and much more comfortable. So that fear-based behavior of always having to be right and always having to, come across looking good and being in charge and all of that's stripped away, and it's allowed him just to be so much more authentic. And instead of building dependency in others who fear him, he has built fierce loyalty in his direct reports and his team because they want to emulate him. Now they would walk through a wall for him, as opposed to thinking about where they may eject from, in the prior life before this integration happens. So there are many, many other examples I could give, but that one is the first one that came to mind. And it is, it is just an incredible thing to watch because you see when you get on the other side of that, possibilities and potential that become available to you that would have never emerged if you had stayed within that shadow space.
Yeah, I have another question. Is that okay, Coach?
Yeah, keep going.
So the relationship between the ego and the shadow, how would you define those two?
Yeah. So in the Freudian, in the psychoanalytic tradition, the ego is sort of the what emerges that's sort of mediating that id and superego battle. And so the ego sort of moderates that. And so in a psychoanalytic tradition, it takes on a bit of a different kind of meaning. But if we're using it in the way that I think you're using it, it's sort of a part of the shadow. And ego is sort of that arrogant, that sort of overconfident side that shows up. That's the way we desperately want to be. So it's that sort of a component of the shadow, because also residing right beside that is excruciating insecurity. And that's why the person is often showing up the way they're showing up, because of that very painful insecurity that's right there beside that ego. So I would say it's a component of the broader shadow piece, but that's usually what people experience. So, when we think of ego, we think of arrogance and some of that, some of those terms as well. But it's really the ego ideal is sort of that persona of who we want to be and what we want people to experience. And when it goes dark, that ego in the sense of arrogance can become a part of that broader shadow component.
Yeah, my experience is interesting. When I do the shadow work with myself, and I basically talk to my shadow and I said, okay, what do you need from me?
Mhm.
What can I do to help you shine? Like you take over, like you create, because you're connected to source. And typically my shadow says, you gotta stop protecting yourself because you're protecting me. And that's the ego is trying to protect,
Yeah.
be safe. As you say, this insecurities that cause us to want to protect or hurt or whatever. So I find that the ego and the shadow are kind of like opposing forces. Like the ego is trying to stop me from feeling what I need to feel to let my shadow just out.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think and I would agree with that conceptualization 100%. I think the way you've described it is spot on. And the other thing that you've sort of touched on, that sort of voice dialogue, or what I call shadow dialogue. Voice was first identified by Hal and Sidra Stone, who were Jungian in their practice, and they essentially said, it's you can talk to the other, you can talk to your shadow, and it's through that dialogue that you really begin that integration process. I'm working. My next book is going to be on teamwork, but the one I've already started outlining, the next one after that is on coaching, and part of that subtitle is going to be a shadow dialogue process. And so, having the guardrails around an executive coaching conversation where you can have a person with some worksheets and some self-assessment, really, have a little more of a framework for going through the kinds of things you're doing. What role are you serving? How are you? What am I getting out of this? Because we're getting something out of it. We're getting something positive, and then what's the cost of that as well? And I think we begin to, as we bring those issues and those ideas and those realizations to the surface, that's where the power is. And so, Jerry Harvey, from my professor at GW, he taught me, one of the things he said is that when you do work in the psychodynamic field, your clients, whether it's a team or individual or an organization, they may think you're a magician because it's going to feel like magic. Because when you take the contents of the shadow or the subconscious and you raise it up to conscious awareness, the integration, the insight, all of that sort of comes with it, feels like magic. It's like, holy cow! How do or sometimes people think that an assessment pegs them so well, and they go, did you read my palm? Is this tarot? I mean, what is this? So there's all of these, and even the sort of shadow dialogue, who exactly are you talking to? So there's always this sort of mystical element or esoteric element around, especially Jungians and Jung's approach. But Harvey was very clear. It's not magic. It's the feeling that you have when the contents of the shadow of the subconscious are brought to conscious awareness. That sort of relief, that insight, that aha moment is transformative, and I believe that's where so much personal transformation occurs. You're talking about a very powerful technique that I think requires a high degree of awareness and a high degree of sort of engagement in this process. But when someone's at the level that you are and they're having that kind of dialogue, it becomes a very easy and very natural way to interact with the other, to take that insight and to realize what may be holding you back. And it's just right there. It's readily accessible. And that is, if we can get to that place, then we really are. I mean, that is an integrated individual that's walking with the shadow. They understand it. They appreciate the power of it, and they're not trying to. They're trying to give it the airtime. And that's what the shadow wants: our attention. It wants some airtime. It wants to be heard. And if it's not, it will be. It'll find a way to come out one way or the other. And so that's the option piece. We can either dialogue with it like you are, or appreciate it, or we can wait until we've had our second martini, or we're exhausted at the end of the day, and boom, it erupts, and there you are. So one way or the other, it's gonna emerge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Awesome. I could talk for days on this subject.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked those questions, and that great answers. Well, that's great insight. You talked about the integration. I want to go there next because that speaks to like we went back to the feelings, right? Like that aha, that relief moment. Like it just feels so good to have that sense of awareness, and then to work on it as well. I might think of that as we've all experienced that in the zone feeling, maybe like. I think about it now with like we get glimpses of that, or we have experiences where we're in the zone. I'd like to think that that will be our normal way of being eventually, because we'll become so aware over a long period of time and work on so many things that, and this is what I'm working on now, is identifying triggers. You said the word trigger earlier. So whenever I feel like I'm not in that state is my indication of something to work on, like something to explore, maybe to begin that dialogue. I was wondering maybe if you could speak more to triggers and how you, first of all, how you might define a trigger, and then what that means, like where do you go after that?
Yeah, and I actually do that in my book. I talk about the unique triggers for each of the three styles really quickly. For an achiever, triggers include ambiguity, the prospect of losing, something not being perfect as they would define it. The trigger for the affirmer, or the prospect of conflict, having to say no to someone, having to have a difficult conversation. Those are triggers of that fear of rejection. And then finally, for the asserter, the prospect of being wrong. This a result not coming in the way that we want. So maybe feeling some shame or feeling embarrassed or some of those things. And so those are some of the triggers are unique by the style. And I hope that's maybe one small contribution I've made, is to be able to focus it in so that an individual understands, if this is my style and my shadow, here are the things I need to be mindful of, because then you can begin to track those. And I love your.
Sorry, can I interrupt real quick? So a trigger being something that could shake you out of feeling good, or something that sets you off?
Trigger is something that activates the shadow. So when I think of a trigger, I think of something that activates the other, that sort of darker side that's repressed, emotional. It's when we overreact. When we overreact, we've been triggered. And so that may be one way to think of it. So trigger is something that activates the shadow. And I think that, integrating it is taking that awareness, taking that sort of personal responsibility, and then reinforcing new ways of being and new ways of behavior. At the end of the day, while I do prefer a psychodynamic approach, I'm also enough of a B.F. Skinner and a behaviorist to know that if you don't reinforce new behaviors, they tend to, fall off, and we can revert back to old ways of being, especially if we're tired or tipsy or something like that. And so I think we have to be very mindful of actively reinforcing those new behaviors. One thing you said that's really interesting. I'm actually working on this image now, literally today. I was working on this with my graphic designer. If you think about two circles and sort of where their intersection is, and I'm sorry I don't have the graphic with me, but it's like on the one extreme you have control, and the other extreme is surrender. And over in control, that's the shadow of the, sort of the asserter, controlling. Everything's got to be, I've got to approve it. No surprises, On the other extreme of surrender can be more of the affirmer. So just sort of a submissive, whatever you want. Let's just, go with the flow. It's sort of just, you can be too far in that extreme. But when you find that sweet spot in the middle between control and then surrendering to that sort of insight or that creativity, or letting yourself play a little bit, that's when we get into that flow state of peak performance, or being in the zone, as you said. And so it's the challenge has to be there. Our skill set has to sort of approximate the challenge, or maybe be just a nick under. So we really got to concentrate and reach for it. But I do think that broadly, it's that intersection of a healthy level of control, and then also a healthy level of surrender. When we put those two together, I think that's where we find that sort of that peak performance state.
Love that. Appreciate that answer. I have one more question, then we could begin to wrap, and I want to give Z another chance to ask anything else that he might want to ask. But I'm just curious what you think. I think this is catching on. Like I don't know. A couple of years ago, I couldn't picture myself doing this work, and now like all I want to do is share it with as many people as possible. What does this work mean? Like where are we going with this? The more that this catches on, people embrace this and also get excited about it. What is that going to mean for? I guess I'm thinking of this on like a worldview. Like what's going to change? What's going to happen here?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I do think that we are there's a shifting of sort of the collective consciousness as we do this work. I mean, 20 years ago, you would have been laughed out of a leadership development room if you wanted to talk about the shadows. Someone said, go find a therapist or a priest, kind of thing. Don't bring that in here. And I think that just in the last 20 years, there's been a tremendous sort of evolution in that thought and in the interest of this. But then again, I think about when I decided to go to graduate school, after 3 years, I was working full time for the federal government, decided to resign and go to school. And my dad wouldn't speak to me for 2 weeks, my late father, because he couldn't understand. Well, wait a minute. Why are you giving this up? Well, I don't understand. You went to college to get a job. And I said, I know, and I hate it. He goes, well, it's a job. You're not supposed to like it. You think I like working. You have family and hobbies, and that's what you love. And so even there was a generation of, like, you don't get to like your work. And so then we came along to say, yeah, you can enlarge your job. You can like what you're doing. And now we're at a place where liking it's not enough. I want to have meaning in my life. And I believe the organization should provide, transformative developmental opportunities that are not just training me how to be more efficient. I want development opportunities. And so cutting edge organizations and those I think that are retaining the highest talent realize that folks need purpose and meaning. And so I think all of that bodes well, because then it sort of comes back to, well, what's getting in the way of that? And of course, Young sort of standing over here going, well, it's the shadow. I told you that, 100 years ago. That's kind of the same. It hasn't changed. That's still what's going on. So I do think there's a shift in the collective consciousness, and I think there's more of an appetite in corporate America than ever before. And I only see that growing as more and more people are exposed to it. They feel the transformative power, and the results follow. That's the other thing. It's like it's the direction of goodness, because you feel better, you feel more integrated, you feel wholer, you show up in a healthier way. And oh, by the way, the organization performs better as well. So it's sort of this direction of goodness that I think it can sustain this movement, really, for lack of a better word.
Love that. Appreciate that. See, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just thank you for the work you're doing. I am curious to read any case studies you have in the organizational space that I could read and share with my teams that I coach and organizations that I coach with, because I think the more exposure the C-suite has to this material, the more coaches like us can participate and help them more than they're getting help now. So
I couldn't agree more. Happy to share those resources. I'm very humbled that I have a number of business leaders that I've profiled in my book that have taken the assessment, and from people, the vice chairman of global strategy with Bank of America, Kathy Bessant, who's the most powerful woman in banking, I think 4 out of the last 5 years, to Steve Clifford, the head coach of the Charlotte Hornets, and sort of a lot of folks in different industries, people that have recognized the power of this work and the results that it produces. So I've got a lot of that in the book, but there's many other articles by other researchers that are showing, I think, this exciting movement toward this, and happy to share those resources as well.
I love to read your book. How about
Thank
Michael
you.
Jordan? Did you get to him yet?
I'm sorry?
How about Michael Jordan? Did you try to get him yet?
No, I subtly began to explore that, and I had someone very close to Michael say, before you ask that question, let me tell you, there were 2 other folks that asked him for an endorsement quote, Phil Jackson and Dean Smith. And he said no to both for reasons around that. He's trademarked and logoed and all of that. Yeah. And so, no, I did not ask. I was given some very good advice, and I thought, well, if those were turned down, I'm pretty sure this. But I do have. So since you asked, I do have Michael's older brother, James Jordan, who's the chief operating officer of the Hornets and a 33-year U.S. Army Airman vet, that is profiled in my upcoming book on. I interviewed him for creating trust in organizational environments, and he really leaned on his military training for a terrific interview. And so I'm very proud and excited to feature him in the next book.
Awesome. Great to meet you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Super cool. Yeah. So Will, could you state so you have a book out now, there's one coming, and then you're working on a third. Is that right? Could you state them all?
Yes. So Actualized Leadership. I'll be crass and just show it. I had it earlier. So this is published by the Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM Press. Meeting Your Shadow and Maximizing Your Potential. This is out now. The manuscript that is about to go to the publisher is called Actualized Teamwork: Managing the Shadow Side of Group Culture. The same sort of psychodynamic approach. If teams are going to actualize their potential, just like individuals, they have to have the courage to acknowledge sort of pattern of the shadow affecting their performance. Hopefully that'll be out at the end of this year. And then next year will be actualized coaching that'll introduce that shadow dialogue process that I referenced earlier. That's still in the sort of the legal pad phase of development. So haven't really started typing that out yet. So that will be at least a year, maybe a year and a half. But yes, so those are the ones that are in the works.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to share those titles in the show notes and maybe even a link to that first one where people can buy it.
Great. It's on Amazon.
Yeah, and as is tradition on the podcast, I'm just curious if there was something today that principle that you were reminded of that is what was joyful for you to bring up or to talk about, or even like what's your favorite part of all this? What do you love the most about this work here?
Well, I'll tell you. My late mentor, Dr. Dominic J. Moneta, I dedicated the book to Dom. He passed away after the book came out about a year and a half ago. One of the things he taught me was that we don't have a time management problem in this country. We have a priority management problem. And so that's not just a glib saying. He taught me that you always have enough time for your number one priority. So pay attention to what you're always doing. If you're always checking or updating social media, or you always find time to watch football, but you're not finishing your paper, or you're not spending time with your family, it's not a time management issue. It's a priority management. So his saying was, you always have enough time for your number one priority. And just in full transparency, to pull the curtain back a little bit here, I don't feel well today. I have not felt well. It's not COVID. It's just been a wave of sort of feeling nauseous just as soon as I got to work this morning. And I thought, at one point around 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, I was like, I'm going to have to email you all and just reschedule this because I'm not sure I can get through it. And then I said, no, this is important. This is important, getting the word out, having these kinds of conversations. And I knew that you had a team that was going to be involved in taking time. And so I did what my mom taught me when I was a kid. I went and ate some saltine crackers and drank a Coke. And sure enough, there's a lot of wisdom in that Gaffney, South Carolina. It worked, whether it was psychosomatic or not, I don't know. But I'm still not 100%, but I feel better. So that guided me today. You always have enough time for your number one priority. And this was my priority today. And I mean that sincerely. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you both. Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, it makes me even more grateful. Will Sparks, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
All right.
Thank you for watching another episode of Truth Seekers. We appreciate your interaction. So please comment, like, subscribe to YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want more, check out some of our links. Links to our masterclass, The Achiever's Mindset, and come join our LinkedIn group. And what do you want to see more of? Remember, we're here to share the simple secrets of successful. So help us do that. What do you want to see? What do you want to see more of? Thanks, and see you again next time.